And I just wanted to say welcome, everybody. I am filling in for David tonight. He's our other programs director. I'm Tom Velasquez. I think most of the people have probably had run-ins with me at some point. I'm the current technology chair for ATD San Diego. And before I hand it over to Dr. Kimberly, I just wanted to bring up a slide about some upcoming events that we have. So just give me 1 second and I'll share my screen. So I just wanted to point out some upcoming events we have. We have our next ATD professional mixer. Right now it is scheduled at West Brew Del Mar. However, we are aware of the current situation with the COVID-19 pandemic, so we're keeping an eye on it. And if we need to pivot and make it virtual, we will go ahead and do that and let everybody know. We also have our Discover the Benefits of ATD San Diego membership, which is held at the first Wednesday of every month. And it's a really good class led by our new membership director, Melissa Esting. And she talks about all the benefits of your ATD membership. And it's a really good class for anybody who's thinking about the L&D field or new to the L&D field. It's a great way to connect with other new members of the chapter. We also have our Coaching for Performance, the art and science of creating a high-performing culture. That is on Wednesday, September 8th. And we also have a new workshop, which we added later this year, which is a Get Good with Articulate Storyline. That is hosted by myself and John Morley. I am just the host. He's the expert at it. I just help him through and kind of play watching the chat and everything. But if you are interested in Articulate Storyline, be sure to check that out. So thank you for allowing me to share that with you. I'm going to stop sharing. And I want to introduce our speaker tonight. So Dr. Kimberly Morse is the VP and COO and Senior Consultant with the ODCL and the Director of IO Solutions of Bilbao Consulting. Did I get that right?
You did, yes.
She is going to be our speaker tonight, talking about change management. And without further ado, I will now hand it over to her.
Okay, thank you so much. So hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I do have a lovely PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to share with you. Feel free to ask questions throughout. I have no problem, answering any questions as needed. That's fine. So I'm just going to get this going nice and pretty. Can you all see this? Thumbs up. Thank you, Kevin. So again, the topic is change management, what it is and why it matters. Again, I am Dr. Kimberly Morse, like Tom had mentioned. So essentially, what is change management? Now, I understand a large portion of everybody on here today are probably in the L&D field, so doing training and development, not really this change management side. So what's really useful right now is to get a solid understanding of how the two very different practices go hand in hand in a lot of ways, and why being a trainer, being in the L&D field is like an essential component within change management. Okay. So just a brief history, hopefully you already know it. If you don't, this might be new to you, and that's fine. But so the roots of change management actually extend all the way back to World War II. And anybody who's done any psych work before would probably know a lot of modern knowledge that we have about organizations and about human behaviors actually is rooted from post-World War II research, okay? So in the late 1940s, this led a gentleman named Lester Koch and another gentleman, John French, to study motivation that's centered around change and what that looks like. So that's where they identified what we know today as behavioral resistance, that pull against change, right? And they really defined 3 different types of change in organizations. And those different distinct types consist of a planned change, continuous change, and a transitional change. Now, this is the interesting thing. Most of the change management practices that we know that have really gone sky high in popularity revolve around that planned change. So they don't really focus too much on that continuous or that transitional change, okay? So what really came first was the 3-step model for change. And again, this refers to planned change, okay? It was developed by a gentleman named Kurt Lewin in the 1950s. And it really just postulates that individuals and groups are influenced by the obstacles that counter their driving forces that are aimed at keeping the status quo. Okay. So when organizational change is needed, they have to identify specific change activities that are needed following the key 3 steps that Lewin developed. Okay. And that is unfreeze to a changing or moving dynamic, and then you refreeze the new behavior. And I'm sure you've seen that at least at some point. You have an old behavior, they work on it to kind of change that behavior. Maybe you're going through some new training. I'm sure if you're trainers, you've seen this, you're giving the training to help people learn new skills or learn new behaviors. And then you have to reinforce it, and that's kind of refreezing it, right? Does that make sense? I see some nodding. Okay, perfect. So this led to something called the theories of action, and this was developed by Chris Argyris and David Schoen in 1974. Okay, this articulates that people have these mental maps, which tells them how to act in various situations. And really, a lot of these mental maps are developed by previous experiences. And I'm sure we can think of that. We kind of dictate what we're supposed to behave like based on prior experiences that we've had, something familiar. So we know kind of what to do, right? But so when you have to figure out how to act, it involves planning, implementing, reviewing actions, especially in an organizational setting. Okay, so you don't just go in and act, you have to stop and plan out these actions, right? Anytime you're doing any type of project or any new initiative, it doesn't involve just acting, it involves planning and then implementing these different changes, okay? But here's the key. Very few people are actually aware of these mental maps that they have going on. So what happens is they don't really articulate why they're behaving in a certain way or why they're choosing a specific action. They just do it out of force of habit, almost like it's an unconscious behavior that they engage in. Okay. And oftentimes we become aware of some of these behaviors by somebody close to us that will kind of point out a certain behavior that you do in a certain situation. Oftentimes it's your spouse. For men, it's probably your wives who are more likely to be like, dude, you act like this all the time. I see Janera's kind of saying some laughing, right? And you're like, what are you talking about? I don't do that ever. It's because you're not aware of those behaviors. And all of us do that. So it's not just a man thing. But I figure wives are more likely to point it out because that's just how wives are. Sorry, I'm totally taking the heat for that one, girls or ladies. I do that to my own husband, so he gets it from me. But that's just kind of what happens, right? But so what happens is something called an espoused theory. So this is how the person describes his or her action, right? So if you say, hey, what did you do? And the person tells you what they did, that's an espoused theory. That's telling you, describing the action, okay? The theory in action is how the person actually acts or behaves in a specific situation, okay? And then there's a model of processes that assists in understanding the theory in use. And this talks about the governing variables. So these are those dimensions that people keep within their acceptable limits. So any action is likely to impact a number of variables. It's almost like that physics principle. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, but you're confined to these variables, to these guidelines that you've set for yourself. Like, this is what I'm okay with. This is where my decisions are going to fall within, okay? And then you talk about your actions strategies. This is where he moves and plans that people use to keep those governing values within your acceptable range. So this is where people are like, listen, this is my comfort range. I'm willing to kind of bend out to here, but I'm not going to go this far. Does that make sense? So you kind of have this range of behaviors that you're willing to stretch to. And then, of course, consequences. And these are what occurs as a result of whatever that action is, okay? It can be an intended or an unintended consequence. And of course, as we all know, these can affect both yourself and other people. So anytime you take any sort of action, whether it's, letting a phone go to one of your colleagues, that can have a consequence. Like, you can get in trouble for not answering it potentially. Your colleague could get mad at you for forcing them to take a call that they didn't want either. Who knows what type of situation can happen, but there's all these things that you have to think about, but on a grander scale when we're talking about change, right? So if you push somebody too far outside of their comfort zone, what do you think some of those consequences might look like?
You get some pushback.
You could get some pushback. Absolutely. Thanks, one. Anyone else? Brett, you're muted. I didn't hear a word you said.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Yeah, so they could freeze up, they could withdraw.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There also
Kevin?
may be anxiety and stress that occurs when you try to get out of your comfort zone, or have to, or need to.
Exactly. Great examples, gentlemen. Thank you. And those are all really great potential unintended consequences if you're trying to make a change too fast, right? Something that I know has happened is sometimes companies will implement a new technology. And what happens is people will, I see some nodding heads, people will push back on that and they'll be like, why can't we just go back to this way? I knew this way worked really well. And they're like, yeah, but we're not doing that anymore. So we need to go this way. And there's a lot of pushback, and some of that pushback does come from people not being comfortable learning the new technology or fearing that they're incapable of learning the new technology. And a lot of times that does come with people who are a little bit more seasoned, who are just more comfortable. And I'm just as guilty of it. I do it too. I think all of us have done it at some point. They're like, why do I need to switch? This works just fine. And it's just a normal human behavior. And then once you get used to it, you're like, okay, this is fine. But it can take some time, and some of that can really expand when it's a bigger change. Joanne, yes.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, in terms of people's reactions to situations, I'm wondering, where does instinctive action or reactions fit in? Because it's not instinctive reaction could be maybe something learned over a period of time so that it's now natural, or so I'm just wondering if you could speak about that.
Absolutely, and thanks for bringing that up. So that comes in a lot of times, especially with these types of situations, comes in what I call that fight or flight reaction that I think most people are familiar with. When some people are placed into really uncertain situations, or situations where they're pushed too far out of their comfort zone, they revert to really their coping strategies. And that's where those unintended or unintentional behaviors come in. It increases their stress level, and then what they feel this psychological unconscious need to do is to find a way to get comfortable again. So they almost fight it to get back to this comfort zone, and 9 times out of 10 it is a learned behavior. But that goes back to that mental maps piece. They're unaware of it, so they don't even realize that they're giving this unintentional pushback or behavior to cope with having to be forced out of that situation. And I'm going to get more into how to help people through that. But a big piece of it that came a few years after the theories of action was actually the 5 stages of grief. And I didn't include it because it's usually something that gets to counseling, if that makes sense. But typically people, when they're faced with significant change, do go through kind of that 5 stages of grief. That's really common when we hear about it mostly when someone passes away. They have to go through these grief, like there's that shock, denial, anger, right? Before they finally get to acceptance, there's some bargaining, all of those phases. But a lot of that ends up being that unconscious, unintentional behavior that just reacts, right? It's like they're going to fight the actual change as much as they can, and they do that through some of these stages of denial. And it can really be their perception of what the change is going to do that can cause that negative reaction. Does that make sense? Did that answer your question? Perfect, thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna move on. So what came next was a diffusion of innovations, and this was developed by Everett Rogers, okay? And this really stated that there are 4 elements that influence diffusion of new ideas through cultures, okay? And these are innovations, communication channels, time, and social systems, okay? So when you look at this within an organization, you can see how these 4 elements can affect how a change is perceived by the people who need to change, okay? And within these four ideas, these four elements, came 5 phases of innovation to decision, okay? And this included knowledge. So it's the knowledge about the change, that persuasion. How are they persuaded? So it's how do they get through those 5 stages of grief? Are they going to be quick, or are they going to take a very long time to go through it before they're persuaded to go into that change? The decision to make the change, okay? So first you have to persuade people before they can all decide, yes, I'm going to make this change, okay? And then there's implementation, which that's where, for the most part, trainers and people in the L&D sphere, this is where you guys end up doing most of your work, is this implementation part, right? You have to help get the message, help train people, help people know what to do. And then there's that confirmation piece, right? Then it's confirmed, the change is done, and you just have to continue reinforcing it, right? So what happened is Everett developed this category of adopters when he realized that you see people that are going to be more likely to adapt to a change early versus later. So you can see it's a nice normal shaped curve, and it's kind of split 50-50 between the early majority and the late majority. So the innovators are usually the people that come up with the change. These are usually those people that are the first ones saying, hey, here's a change we need to make, right? The early adopters are going to be those people that are saying, yeah, that's a great idea, let's do that, right? And then the early majority will be like, you know what, we could do this, let's adopt this, let's try it out and see what happens. And then that late majority is usually those people that are like, well, hold on, I want to stop, I want to see if it's really going to be worthwhile. And then they're like, you know what, I see how it's working, I'm going to go ahead and adopt. And then those laggards, these are these people that are really pushing back. These people are like, listen, I'm not going to do it, I don't want to do it, you can't force me to do it. Those type of people that you get significant pushback from, okay? And I'm sure anybody who's gone through any change has seen that before with people, right? Any organization, we've seen these categories. There are some people that are quicker to take the change and just run with it, and some people are going to give a lot of pushback, right? And that's normal. It happens in all organizations, okay? One thing, though, that came a few years later, oh, I'm sorry, I almost forgot. It is important to note that there are intrinsic characteristics that will influence the adoption or rejection of change, okay? This includes the relative advantage. So how are they going to benefit from this? Compatibility. Is the change compatible with what they're doing? The degree of complexity. How complicated is this going to be for me to learn, right? Trialability. Are we able to try it out? Is there almost a sandbox version? Can we test it before we roll it out, right? Can we get some experience first? And then observability. Are we going to be able to see this happen in practice? Are we going to be able to, really get some time to kind of role play it, whatever it might be? Does that make sense? Okay. So 30 years later, a gentleman, Geoffrey Moore, recognized that there exist gaps in the diffusion of innovation model. So we found that these gaps were actually enough to derail the change efforts. And so what interestingly happens is the gap exists between the early adopters and the early majority. And you see there's this chasm here. So if you cannot get these people here, this 15%, to communicate effectively with the remaining percentage of people, you're going to have a major problem, okay? Because what do you think is going to happen if these early 16% can't bridge this chasm?
Change isn't going to be implemented.
Exactly. Great, Kevin. Exactly. Because the people who are really going to be implementing this change are these people here, the pragmatists, the risk averse, these people that are really going to look at kind of those negatives and saying, hey, wait a minute, these are some potential red flags for doing this. So if the early people, the innovators and the really early adopters, can't convince them that there are reasonable solutions to overcome those red flags, the change won't move forward, okay? So where do you think you as trainers are going to be the most impactful in this process? Joanne, yeah.
When there is buy-in from the majority of the people?
Absolutely, when there's buy-in, right? So when you have at least this first 50% that have said, you know what, yeah, let's roll this out, then trainers have to go in. You're going to work with the change management consultant to develop some new training material to train the remainder of the population and train everybody to say, this is the new practice, this is what we're doing, right? You have to get the decision makers on board, and you have to have enough buy-in from people to go ahead and make those changes. Great point. So the biggest question is, how do we bridge that chasm, right? And this is where change management consultants come in, okay? So what do change management consultants do? So to start with this, we have to ask, what is involved with change management? So change management includes the strategic and tactical activities involving project management practices, business process improvement, and organizational change management. So it's a lot involved, okay? And as you see, it follows kind of this path to define, analyze, plan, execute, and reinforce. So you're seeing some of this come up repeatedly, right? We have to define the problem. We have to analyze what's going on, where are the main issues, what needs fixing. Then we have to build a plan, right? Build the most reasonable plan to address these problems that we've identified. And then we execute it. And then, of course, as you know, we have to reinforce the new behaviors or the new skills. We can't just say, and we're done, and leave, because the fact is 70% of change initiatives fail. And most are going to fail within 6 months of the change being implemented. So if that reinforcement piece isn't continued, that change will not be sustained long term. Okay, so that's something important to remember. So as trainers and anybody in L&D, that's a crucial component for you, is to remember that just because something new has been implemented doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. It has to continually be reinforced time and time again before people really continue it. And that comes down to some of those laggards, because those laggards, as you remember, are going to be the ones that are going to derail the whole thing. From the late majority to those laggards, they're going to just be like, well, we can just go back to this way because this was the way everything worked, right? They're going to go back to their old ways if we don't continually reinforce it, okay? So what does this include? So change management, right? It includes strategy. So we sit down with stakeholders and we have to strategize how to look at everything. What are we looking at? Where do we need to go? Who needs this the most? You have to look at the key players and really go into it with an unbiased mindset. And that can be really difficult in a lot of organizations. You organize. Okay, I think that sounds almost common sense, but you'd be surprised how little people want to organize these major overhaul events and all the tiny little moving pieces that are going to go into it. Okay, improve. You have to develop those improvement strategies, right? It's not just going in and doing it, but you're developing those different improvement strategies. You're looking at what needs to improve. You're defining that. You're looking at, how do we define this? How do we look at this? What is it that needs to improve? And making sure that you're really catching all of those behaviors that go into whatever that main goal is or main problem is. And you're really addressing all of those pieces to it. Does that make sense?
Dr. Kimberly, Joanne has another question, if it's okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Joanne, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Can you go back to the last slide? Thank you.
Yes.
So I'm looking at this diagram and I was thinking about the previous diagram where you had the 5 phases that started with the knowledge and then something else and then all the way to like implementation with knowledge and persuasion, right? So would you say that if we can overlay the 2 diagrams, that define analysis plan would fit somewhere between knowledge and persuasion before getting to the decision? And then if so, how much time do you think normally is needed for people to stay to work on the knowledge and persuasion piece in the entire process?
Great question. So some of that I'm going to get into in a little bit. So if I don't address it a little later, like the time piece, definitely remind me, because that might be the one I might forget to completely address. And I'm probably going to end up giving you a vague answer, like it depends, but it does depend too, which kind of is unfortunate, and I'm sorry. It kind of like it goes back to that complexity. How hard is it? Does this apply to my job? So some of that can really determine the length of time it takes to persuade a group of people to adopt a new change. Does that make sense? But some of the other questions about overlaying this in the process, you'll see where it fits in together a little bit later when I talk about some of the more common processes in change management. Okay. Okay. So we went over strategy, organize, improve, and then motivate. This is that almost that persuasion part. We have to motivate people, right? And kind of to Joanne's point, not everybody is easily motivated, right? They aren't, it's not like a dog, for a lack of a better analogy. Like I can put like a Slim Jim in front of my dog and he'll do just about anything I tell him to, right? Because that's how easy it is. People are far more complicated, and we should be. But it also makes it harder when we're trying to motivate people to adapt to a new change, okay? So you have to find out what's going to motivate them to change with the organization, okay? Also measure. We have to measure what we're changing. We can't just go in and say, we're going to change, how people come in the morning. Okay, well, what does that mean? We have to really quantify that. We have to be able to go in and give something measurable, right? This is why a lot of times you'll see those employee engagement surveys, employee satisfaction surveys. I've also used customer satisfaction surveys. Sometimes what I'll use is a tool like a personality assessment. With my own company, with Bilbao Consulting, we use predictive index. With ODCL, I know we're certified for the DISC survey. So some of these will implement as ways to kind of measure the onset behaviors and then take a look at where we need to be and are we really making that improvement that needs to be made to get to that right end result. Does that make sense? Sometimes we'll create something new. It really depends on the needs of the organization and what that change is, okay? From there, teamwork. Change management consultants aren't doing this alone, as you could probably imagine. Any change initiative relies on the cooperation from members in the organization. And this can be people from leadership, obviously people in the L&D department, trainers, even people within the other departments. We rely on everybody getting on board as much as possible, those early adopters, right? Who are willing to say, hey, this is a good idea, let's do this. And we really drive that to get to those later people, okay? Those late adopters, okay? So really what we're doing is we're pursuing organizational excellence through change management consulting. And this gets complicated, right? It's not easy. If it was easy, the kids could do it, right? So it gets more and more complicated. So this relies on engaging your stakeholders. So you have to talk to everybody that matters in the organization, from the top all the way down to the bottom, even getting that feedback from those clients or customers, seeing what people are saying. I'll even go to, Google reviews or Yelp reviews and see what people are saying that they might not be reporting to my client, because that's a big source of income. If I have a client come to me saying, listen, I can't get people to, come to interviews, I'm going to Glassdoor and I'm seeing what people have said. What's a review here? What are some pros and cons? You're looking at all these different data points to see what's going on. And then you want to talk to them. You engage with them with interviews and things like that. You help the company find a solution to their business problem. We are not problem solvers, but we help guide people through solving their problems, because the fact is everybody has a different way to solve their problem. And if I provide or propose a different solution, they might not like that. So it's not my job to give them a solution. It's my job to help them see potential pitfalls of their solutions that they're proposing. Does that make sense? Okay. Support processes. So I help change managers. We help build these support processes throughout the change initiative, okay? So we're finding people in the organization who are really going to be there to support. A lot of times it's managers, as you'll find in your training departments. These people help you support this change process throughout, because these are the people that are going to continue to do this work after the change management consultant is no longer with that company. Make sense? Okay. We identify change resistance. So this goes back to something Joanne brought up. We have to identify where that resistance is coming from. What is it? Where is it coming from? Who is it coming from? You know, and really try and identify that as early as possible. And then listen to it. That's a key here that a lot of people don't like to acknowledge. You have to listen to that resistance, because some of that resistance might be rooted in some really valid points, and you have to address that, okay? You apply the change management, right? So only after you've done all of these pieces are you going to go ahead and apply the change management, okay? And then from there, you develop tools to continue to work on the change, to continue reinforcing. So you see this cycle kind of keeps repeating. At the end, it says continue to develop, continue working on these changes that have been made, and you just keep working on it so it stays new and it stays reinforced and it stays as part of what the people are doing, okay? Okay. So why are change management consultants needed? Because change management consultants do apply structured change management approach and methodology for the people impacts of change. And that's the key here. We don't just work on the operation side, we work on that people side. And that's really a key component to kind of going back to what I just said, is that listening part. We're not just saying we're doing this, go do it, right? We're not Apple. We're not just going to throw a new phone at you once a year and say, here's your new phone, go pay $1,000 and ta-da, have fun with it, figure it out on your own. But we have to say, okay, we're doing this to change. People are affected. Let's see how to help them through this change as smoothly as possible, okay? We diagnose, design, implement, and assess the change management strategies and plans in support of overall organizational excellence initiatives. So we're really looking at all of these pieces, the inner workings and kind of all of these cogs in the machine, and what's going to happen if you do this. What's going to happen if you move this piece over here? Does that make sense? So we're looking at all of these moving pieces and saying, okay, this works this way and this is working this way. And if we tweak this up here, these are some of the intended or unintended consequences over here. Does that make sense? So we have to look at this from almost an out of the box thinking to say what might happen, when and where, and how do we diagnose this, and how do we make sure that we can assess these changes as they go. Okay. We provide significant input in the development of communication plans. We sponsor roadmaps, the stakeholder assessments, training plans, and resistance management plans. So we don't develop them necessarily, but we help companies develop them and create them, and we give them some best practices, okay? So I've seen companies that make a change and they don't tell anybody what's going on until they implement it. And then they get a significant amount of resistance from their employees because no one knew what was coming, okay? You don't want to do that to people, especially not trainers. Like, so those training plans need to be communicated early, right? Whatever's coming down the pike, you need to know, because you can't just go in on Monday and they're going to say, okay, go create this e-learning by tomorrow and go. I'm pretty certain that there's going to be several people that would sit there and look at them and be like, that's not going to happen. So you just need to have realistic expectations, and it's just not going to get done, and it'll delay the change because they didn't communicate effectively early, right? And then, of course, we administer measurement systems to track the adoption, utilization, and proficiency of changes. We work collaboratively as part of a team that often includes those project managers, business analysts, and how's it going? What's going on? What have you seen? What are you hearing? I see my internet connection is unstable, so I apologize right now. So if I'm chopping out, raise your hand and I'll repeat anything if you need me to, okay? So ultimately, we really work with our clients to make sure that the change is being implemented as effectively as possible, okay? So the change management process. So this is where, Joanne, some of your questions were, okay? So as you can see, there are lots of different types of processes that can be used, okay? I'm gonna go through some of them so you don't have to memorize them all. The fact is there's tons of them, but which one is the right one, okay? That's always the biggest question. How do we know which one to choose? Ultimately, change management consultants look at the context, the environment in which change is occurring. We look at the content, what the change itself is, what does it consist of, right? The process, the way in which the change is being implemented, like how does the company want to implement this change, okay? The people. So who are the people in this organization? What is their view on change, their ideas, their commitment to the organization and to the change? And then the purpose. So again, this is the reason why the change is taking place. So it's easier to make a change if the people in the organization understand the importance of the change or if it's a necessary change, okay? If people don't perceive that it's a necessary change, you have to help them realize the benefit of that change and the change management process, okay? So if someone's like, oh, my computer died, no one's going to argue with you. Say, okay, we're going to get you a new computer. That's a small change, but people would be like, yes, please, I want a new computer, right? Almost anybody at work would be glad to take a newer computer, right? People don't want to hang out with a 5-year-old computer. They'll be like, I want one, yeah. Or going back to cell phones, a new cell phone comes out. How many people are buying the newest cell phone? Lots. That's why they make lots of money. So people are not inherently necessarily opposed to change, but it comes down to why. Why is that change happening? What is it that's motivating them to change? What do they benefit from it? Okay. So some commonly used change management models. There are 3 main models that many consultants are familiar with. This includes the McKinsey 7S framework, okay? And I'm gonna go through these a little more in depth in a minute, okay? Kotter's 8-step process for leading change, okay? The ADCARS change management model, okay? There are other methods, and often a consultant utilizes his or her skill set to determine the most appropriate course of action, okay? So the McKinsey 7S framework, this was developed by Tom Peters and Robert Waterman, okay? And you have the hard S's. So these are those hard skills or those hard components as opposed to the soft skills, right? So your strategy, your structure, your system, these are things that are really technical, that are kind of, it is what it is, right? What is your business strategy? Someone usually has that written down, like it's developed, people have vetted it out. They can say, our business strategy is ABC. And you can say, great, let's take a look at that. Your structure, what's the structure of the organization? Most organizations have a hierarchical structure, and that's really common. So we look and see, are there issues with the structure of the company? Is there something going on there? Does it need to change? Does it need to be tweaked? Do we have people in the right places? Does everybody know the structure or what the structure should be? Because some of that can have influences on who answers to who and who can give orders or instructions to somebody else, right? And then the systems. What systems are in place with the company? And this could be everything from a technology system to the communication systems to just kind of those nonverbal systems that people have. Like, what is a power structure? What are just some of those other inherent systems that exist within an organization? So we're looking at all those different components, okay? And then your soft S's, the shared values. These can be things that are often unspoken, okay? These things that people just assume a company or your team agrees with, right? The style, what is the work style? Are people comfortable, coming in jeans and a t-shirt, or is there like an unspoken rule that you can't come in wearing those clothes, like you have to wear a certain type of dress? Like there are certain unspoken rules or certain style of work that happens in different teams and different organizations that once you're ingrained in it, you just know it, but it's not really written down anywhere. Does that make sense? Okay. The staff. People can change all the time. Like there's constantly new staff coming in, or people are leaving, they're retiring, they're being let go, whatever happens. But ultimately, managing and relating to staff is a huge soft skill. So we need to be able to take that into consideration. How are managers leading? How are people being related to? Do we have conflicts? Most organization problems are people problems, to be fair. Okay, because somebody's not doing something right or somebody's in the wrong spot. How do we change that? Even the change itself, we're motivating people, we're motivating the staff. Okay, and then skills, right? Do your people, do your employees have the right skills that they need? If not, how do we fix that? Okay, I'm sure as trainers, you're like, we train them, right? That's the easiest solution, but that's not always as easy as just saying we're going to give them new skills. We know that people are not as always easy to learn new skills as we would like them to be. The pros about using this type of framework is that it shows weaknesses in an organization and it highlights the areas that need attention. This can be huge for places that maybe are unaware of what their strengths and weaknesses are, okay? The cons, it's really complex. It requires significant attention and care, and often external support is needed in its application, okay? It focuses on the more formal aspects, but it can miss some of those informal aspects in the change management process, okay? So just some pros and cons there, okay? Are you guys ready for me to go to the next slide? I know some of you are taking notes. Nodding, okay. So Kotter's 8-step process for leading change. So it is built within that 3-step model from earlier, that unfreeze, move, freeze, refreeze, right? But as you see, it expanded it with more comprehensive steps, okay? So some of the pros include it forces the organization to set a sense of urgency and to set the leadership team to be influential in enacting change. So you'll see these steps. So you highlight the urgency. We build the team who's going to make the change. You define a new vision. Share the vision. Encourage people to act. You create these quick wins. You track the progress. You strengthen the change. So a lot of this comes from leadership. Okay. The cons are that it's a top-down approach. So it can actually become an enforcement tool, and it risks alienating the employees. So employees are going to push back more on a process like this if they're not included in it. Okay. Then there's the ADCARS change management model. And this was founded by Jeff Hyatt, who's the founder of Proshi. And ADCARS stands for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. Okay, so it's kind of going back to those same steps from before. It equips leaders with strategies and tools, and it equips the individuals with information, which is really helpful. Okay, the pros are that it's a bottom-up approach. So unlike the other one that's a top-down, this one goes from the bottom up. It's focused on the individuals, and it can actually accelerate the rate of change in the organization, because now you're focusing on getting the people who are going to be responsible for the change, like actually changing their behaviors, engaged in that process. The cons are that it's actually best suited for incremental changes. So it's not suited for those major transformational initiatives. So it's almost like if you're going to do a new technology, this would be great for it. You're going to create awareness, you're going to create that desire, you're going to create the knowledge around it, you're going to help them with their ability, and then you're just going to reinforce through some, continual trainings later on. But if you're changing something really big, that's not going to work, okay? You're going to need to have something a little bit more comprehensive. So this comes in the ODCL model, okay? So within the ODCL group, which stands for the Organizational Development and Change Leadership Group, we have the comprehensive consulting model. It incorporates 4 key stages, okay? I'm gonna release the picture of it in a minute because it's a lot that goes on, okay? These stages include obtaining commitments, setting expectations, the actualization phase, okay? And of course, the exit stage, all right? Oh shoot, did I leave? Oh, sorry, I got too quick. So as you can see, now I'm clicking too many buttons because I'm trying to move all my people. With the ODCL leadership consulting model, That obtaining commitment piece has 3 steps to it. There's the initial contact, there's clarification, developing those expectations, right? Early on, we sit down and we figure out what it is that is they're expecting from me as a consultant, and my expectations for them as a potential client are going to look like, okay? Before we even get to that contracting part, and that's where I enter into the company, okay, into the client. And then we develop what's called the planning and implementation. And we usually have a number of different employees from various levels in the organization as part of a team, okay? And these people help us to really diagnose what's going on at the various levels, okay? And we analyze that. So this process can take a very long time before we even get to that part where we're convincing or persuading people to take those next steps. Okay, Joanne, so do you see, I hope, Joanne, this helps kind of your question from earlier, how do you overlay them? So you see, it's a lot of building it as we go. So we're getting, like as consultants, we're gaining different knowledge, but then one thing that I promote significantly with my clients is that as soon as we have a contract and they know we're going to be making a change, and we know what that change is likely to look like, to start some form of communication down to the appropriate people and make sure that there's transparent communication throughout the process. Does that make sense? So this way, when you implement that change, when you actually get to that implementation part, you don't have as much pushback. And oftentimes we have somebody called a champion for change, right? And these people are those people that are usually those influencers. This goes back to some of the soft skills. Who do we know that people look to? Who is that main social person that's really driving different behaviors in the office, right? I'm sure everybody has kind of that clique in an office, like you have your group of people that you socialize with. So who in that group would you say kind of pushes the behaviors for the rest of the group? Who's going to be the most vocal? Because you're always going to have somebody really vocal about implementing it and then somebody really vocal about not implementing it. So you have to get those vocal people to be on the same page and hopefully get that vocal person that's opposing you on the other side as quickly as possible. And kind of like what I was saying before, Joanne, is that can take a lot of time depending on what the change is. Okay, if you're overhauling some major things, that might be a problem. If you're making smaller, easier changes that benefit their day-to-day job, that'll be a much easier persuasion. Okay, so I've seen it where it can take a week to persuade people because it's easy changes. And I've seen it where some of these can get derailed for several months while people fight and argue and push back over it. And it's a matter of how effective is leadership at finding these champions for change and really promoting them and getting their voices out and making sure that this change is moving forward as smoothly as possible. More often when there's significant pushback, it comes back to their communication is not as effective as it could be, if that makes sense. So most of it comes back down to communication. And I'm going to get into something really important about that in just a moment. Okay. Any questions about some of these main models? So we're good. Thumbs up. Okay. So the overcoming, yeah, right.
Sorry.
No,
So,
you're fine.
when you go into a business, say a client or a potential client, do you use any particular one, or do you kind of just like get a good feel for the company and then choose the right model for the company?
Usually, as a consultant, I'll go in and I'll see what, it goes back to that context. What's going on? What's the change? What are they looking to do? It's a lot of that digging. So I'll go in and do an initial consultation meeting with them to see what's going on first. If I don't need to help them with a really complex, complicated change, I'm not going to be engaging in a lot of complex, complicated change processes because it's unnecessary and it just adds a lot of time to it. If it's something really easy, we can say, hey, we can just do, like I said, that ADCAR method that's, just awareness and bringing them through and saying, hey, here's your change, let's go. And sometimes it's just, when it's an easy change, sometimes they just want to make sure that they're going through the change process in the right way, if that makes sense. A lot of times that comes in with newer businesses or smaller companies that maybe this is the first time they're making a change and they've never done it before. So they want to make sure that they're getting the right buy-in and they're doing the right thing. Bigger companies will end up having something, especially if it's major changes, that's far more complicated because there's usually more moving pieces. So usually it goes back to that context, content, purpose, really relies on some of that. But a good consultant will look at really what's needed and do the best for the company in that situation. Great question.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Okay, so we're going to move on to overcoming resistance to change. So there are several reasons for resistance to change, and I know we talked about some of these before. Most often people just prefer stability and comfort, right? If it's not something that they have to change or want to change, they feel like it's easier to live with the constant day-to-day expectations. They know what's going to happen, right? Some common reasons can include a fear of job loss, poor communication and engagement, the lack of trust in management, the unknown, and poor timing. Maybe they have a lot going on in their life externally, and this change is just coming at a time when they're already overstressed with things going on at home, right? And there's nothing you can do to control that. It's just, how do we manage their reactions to this, okay? So ways to overcome resistance and effectively engage employees. You have to actively listen. And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier. You have to listen to the people who are resisting to find out what their reason for resisting is. What is going on? Why is there such pushback, okay? And again, it's communicate the change effectively. So talk about almost step by step what's going to happen. And then you implement the change, often in several stages, especially if this is a big change to them. You don't want to kind of pull the rug out from under them all in one shot. You do them in piece by piece, okay? Especially if it's something that's really huge for the organization. Like if you need to, like one company I worked with had to scale back their physical locations. We had to go in, take a look at, okay, what locations are performing well, which ones are not, how do we communicate this? How is the best way to do this? And from there, not only was it scaling back, but they also needed to improve some of their business methods within their actual customer-facing employees. So we couldn't just do it all at once. Scale back, then retrain their new staff on the new method, right? So it's a piece-by-piece process when you're doing something like that, okay? So you have to be mindful of what you're doing, okay? So effective communication. So communication is the cornerstone of an effective change initiative. And I love that my animation didn't work right. So effective communication requires 4 main components. The person sending the message must present the message clearly and in detail with integrity and authenticity. Now, the one thing that I've heard a lot with communication is people always say that it's the person hearing the message has to take it right. And this is unfortunate because people overly rely on the people receiving the message to receive it properly. However, there are many times that the person sending the message is not sending it as clearly as they think they are. So there are many times that people will have to ask clarifying questions because it's just not as clear as they thought it was initially, okay? And trainers, this might be something that you come across quite a bit, is having these questions asked of, what do you mean? What is this? I don't understand. If you have a lot of people asking that, maybe the new training isn't as clear as it could be. And then it's going back and saying, okay, what are they seeing that I'm not seeing? Yes, Kevin.
Yeah, the sender receiver model is so important in communications. One thing that's part of EQ, emotional intelligence, is active listening. And the easiest way to explain that for me, the way I use it, is if I'm in an interview, okay? So if someone says something to me and I'm not sure what they actually said, I repeat it back to them. So what you're saying is this. so we understand that. Also, when you're actually on Zoom or in a situation where you're face to face, you know, I don't know, 80% of the communication is nonverbal. So if someone's saying something, you kind of lean in a little bit, not too much though, to invade their space, to show that you're interested in that. And then the eye contact, obviously, lots of different things, but it's the sender receiver model is great, but it can be enhanced using active listening for sure.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kevin. Great point, definitely. Some other key components is that the person receiving the message must be able to listen just as much as the sender, right? So the person receiving it has to actively listen to it as well. Ask the questions for clarity and trust the sender of the message. This is key, that trustworthiness is crucial for this message being sent and received the correct way. The delivery method chosen must suit the circumstances and the needs of both the sender and the receiver of the message, okay? The best example I have seen of this in real life, and this was, I have no great way to say how I felt about this. A company decided they were doing mass layoffs and pulled 50% of their staff across the country into various big rooms, basically like auditoriums almost. And what they did was they did a conference call and fired everybody via conference call around the country and said, this is your severance, this is HR, here's Cobra, here's this. And I just sat there mortified when I heard that they had done that. And I was just like, there's going to be so much backlash after this. And there absolutely was. And it was by far the absolute worst way to let go of people, because there was absolutely zero personal inflection to it. And most of these people, like, it was just layoffs. Like most of them had done nothing wrong. They just happened to be on the wrong side of the stick that got pulled, I guess. And it was really heartbreaking when I heard that story from so many of them. And then the people who were left just sat there every time they got pulled into a meeting being terrified that they were going to be fired too. So that, like, it creates this sense of fear in the people who stay behind. And then they're not motivated to do much of anything. So if you're going to deliver a message, make sure you're doing it in the appropriate method, okay? And that also goes to some generational differences, okay? People who are a little bit older, boomers, are going to be more likely to prefer something face-to-face or even over a telephone call, okay? Gen Xers tend to prefer a telephone call or even email. Millennials will deal with email, even some instant chatting, right? Some messenger, things like that, really quick. When we're looking at Gen Z, they almost prefer instant message and texting, right? So we're noticing almost this trend where we're getting less and less formal. But again, inherently, certain things have to be delivered face-to-face. That's the way they're most effective. So just remember, certain things like training things, even via Zoom is better than not at all, right? If we can't be in person, Zoom is a better option for that. But you still don't want to just email somebody, hey, here's a new e-learning module, go take it, right? Especially if it's really complicated. We have to be able to answer questions. Kelly, did you have any thoughts?
No, I'm just nodding in agreement. And I came back on the Zoom as soon as you started to say the things that you said, which I am totally 100% in line with about layoffs.
Yes.
Some people are getting quite late. I mean, it's been happening over the last 15 years. Kind of reminds me, I mean, what you just described is like right up there with the way Radio Shack handled their layoffs 15 years ago.
Yeah, and it's sad that that's a method that they're still holding on to. Like, it's the most impersonal and insulting way to do it, in my opinion. But clearly, these companies did not ask me for my opinion before they did it. So.
Oh, they don't either. But I was all over the SHRM bulletin boards that when that came out this time of the year 15 years ago. I'm like
horrified.
As soon as I could, picked myself up off the floor, I was typing.
I bet. Thank you, Joanne. Yes.
Yeah. So about the piece, how what you said about how Generation Z's and
Generational
Y's,
differences, yeah.
generational differences, and that the younger generations would prefer electronic communication. And I'm wondering, with especially any issues that are sensitive or involves like mass scale change over maybe a shorter period of time, whatever, isn't it always better? I mean, instead of just say, okay, we're going to cater to their communication preferences, can we say that it's usually better to have some sort of live event or live conversation?
Absolutely. That's
to
kind of what I
convey
was getting at the end. Yeah. So certain messages you always want to do in person, like face to face, if at all possible, Zoom, if not. Anything like really sensitive nature like that, yes, you'd want to do more in person. I think there's a level of respect and dignity that it gives to the receiver in those cases, that really reminds them that they're still human. And at the end of the day, that's what we need to do, is remind people that they're human, and we see them and we value them as people, right? And that's one of the key things, I think. When companies look at just numbers, they forget those are people. They're not just numbers, if that makes sense. But yes, great point. So more sensitive topics, definitely do in person if at all possible.
And another thing is, even if an issue is not as sensitive, I'm thinking that throughout the change management process, that maybe in the beginning, live communication might be better to kind of introduce the context of the change, and then supported by text communication or tip sheets or handouts.
Absolutely.
Like, here's more information if you want to read it, but we also have office hours, or if you want to talk to your managers about the change, or we'll have support groups or work groups.
Exactly. And that's exactly how I do it. I don't just sit there and text people, there's this change coming. No, we have it in person, we go through it. And that's exactly how you do it. You give a fact sheet, or you give some emails, here's some links if people want the links. You give different resources for the people that are going to use those different resources. So that's some great pointers, yes. So finally, the last component is that the content has to resonate and connect on some level with the beliefs of the receiver. So this kind of goes back to earlier when we were talking about the applicability of the change. Does this matter? Why? Is it resonating? Why? What about it is going to resonate? Certain people are going to pick up different pieces of a message. And I know we've all seen this. We've made a sentence and 5 people will hear it very differently, because different pieces of that sentence are resonating with those different people in different ways. So we have to make sure that we're really responding to what's resonating with them and making sure that they're going to respond in the way we want them to respond, if that makes sense, which of course can be challenging when there's a lot of people hearing it a lot of different ways, but that's just part of the game, right? Which is unfortunate. But that's why, kind of what Joanne was saying, we want to have those opportunities for people to come back and ask questions later and say, hey, let's have a focus group. Hey, let's keep chatting about that. Here's a fact sheet. Here's all these things. That's why we give additional resources, okay? So some great ways to improve communication. Communicate consistently, frequently, and through multiple challenges, okay? And that can be email, that can be text, that can be phone calls, that can be focus groups, that can be bulletin boards, that can be anything, like all those different ways, right? Communicate all that is known about the changes as quickly as possible, right? So you don't, like I said, we don't want to wait. You want to do it as it comes, as it pertains to the people. Provide significant amount of time for people to ask questions, request clarification, and provide input. This is kind of going back to what I said before. I would never go into a training department and say, hey, we're going to roll out these 9 new training programs by the end of next week. Get them ready. Bam, go. People might actually try to murder me for doing that. So I don't do that. I have to say, okay, these are some things we're thinking of. What is your input? What do you think will work best? How would you communicate this? And I like to get feedback from my trainers and my L&D professionals, because that's what you're there for. That's what you're good at, right? I'm not good at that. That's what your strengths are. So I need to know what your input is and where you think we're going to be most effective, okay? Clearly communicate the vision, the mission, and objectives of the change management effort, right? You want to get that buy-in, so you have to keep communicating this, okay? And again, listen, kind of like what Kevin was saying, actively listen. The ability and willingness to listen is essential to effective communication, okay? So how can trainers support the change management process? This is the good stuff, right? Training actually increases the rate of change management success. Managers need e-learning training in the change management process to ensure they know how to be advocates for change while providing appropriate support. They benefit from refresher trainings, right? So you don't have to redo a whole new training, but sometimes it's some refreshers. What are people missing? What are they still not getting? Do it like almost a micro learning. That can sometimes help, right? Training helps maintain visibility and encourage belonging in the organization. So sound induction training that clearly shares the vision, mission, values, and strategies should be offered. We should continue to offer some different trainings like that, okay? Again, training promotes employee engagement. As long as it's not completely outdated training, it usually does get engagement, right? Managers may need training to deliver change messages incrementally to teams. So just as much as the employees need this at the individual contributor level, a lot of times managers will need trainings on how to best implement and send these messages to their teams, okay? That's where trainers can really be useful and support the process. So the change management consultants versus the trainers. So while change management consultants have the same objectives as trainers and even HR, which ultimately is organizational improvement, there are some key differences. So change management consultants work to create more effective organizations and processes. We design and implement interventions for large scale change, which is the processes, the environments, the social systems, et cetera, all those different moving pieces, right? And we typically have studied organizational theories, group theories, action research, appreciative inquiry, systems theories, all these fun theories, right, that just go around our heads, and we can talk about lots of things theoretical and people will be like, you're funny, go away from me, right? Like we're done talking to you. And it's like at a party, they're like, okay, I'm gonna go talk to fun people over here who don't talk about this, right? Trainers are professionals that improve skills and knowledge of individuals. You develop content, programs, and courses to build skills and knowledge. You have a deep understanding and knowledge of e-learning theories and the intricacies of learning management systems. So you guys are rock stars at what you do within this L&D sphere that really change management consultants just don't do, right? And most of us don't want to do it, right? And I'm sure the same is true the other way. L&D people don't necessarily want to handle everything change management consultants do, but we do work together really, really well, because that's what we do. We work together to get these change processes implemented, right? So how can trainers work with change management consultants? So again, like I said, trainers are an essential resource in any change initiative. And you predominantly work in 3 key domains, okay? Cognitive, which is that knowledge piece, psychomotor, which is those skills, and affective, the attitude, right? So with your trainings that you're giving, you're really enhancing the KSAs of these employees, and that's essential, okay? And change initiatives rely on the ability to change those attitudes and beliefs and the skills of the people within an organization. Otherwise, the change initiative is going to fail. So you see, you guys are really like our hidden key here for the success of a change initiative, okay? I bet you didn't think you guys were that big of rock stars, right? Okay, so the trainer's 5-step process is, of course, to receive the message. So this is going back to what Kevin was mentioning earlier. So be aware and receptive to what others are saying. Now, this does not mean you have to agree with them. You just have to say, I understand what you're saying, right? You respond to the message, and there are many ways to respond. You can agree, comply, disagree, react negatively, or no reaction, right? You can just not react. And no reaction should not be considered a positive, negative, or even a neutral response. It's just a non-reaction, okay? You should refer to worth or value attached to the message or the behavior change. You need to respond to the why of the change, and this is important. And it goes back to that why. Why is this important? Why does this matter? People don't perceive it as mattering, they're not going to engage in the change, right? Organizing, you have to prioritize and structure values, right? And I think trainers do this really well. They're going to say, listen, people are going to need to know how to do this before they can do this, right? You need to know how to turn on a computer before you can open up any of the programs on it. I know that's kind of simplistic, but that's basically the same idea. Crawl before you walk, right? And internalizing. So once the change is made, it must be reinforced, and people demonstrating desired behavior should be recognized and acknowledged. And a lot of that comes back to the training efforts. So everything that my L&D rock stars are doing, this is where you come in. You have to keep reinforcing that. And sometimes that comes back to saying, listen, we need a new training because these people aren't doing this, or they stopped doing this, or maybe they're having trouble with this technology or whatever it is. So we can do a refresher course, right? And then definitely recognizing and acknowledging when people are getting it right. I think we all like to be acknowledged when we've done something right after we've struggled learning it, right? And I don't mean gold stars just to give everybody a gold star, but it really means to really appreciate that human side of change, okay? So we're moving on to establishing your role. So change management consultants use a variety of interventions to help organizations through a change. And these include those individual interventions. These can include counseling, training, goal setting, performance management, et cetera, anything on that face-to-face, one-on-one level. Team or work groups. So this goes back to some of those focus groups like Joanne was mentioning. Team building, job enrichment, quality of work, conflict management. And that conflict management piece, as you guys are probably aware, is a huge component in any change management initiative. Intergroup, so workflow planning, scheduling reviews, group decision making. So we try to get a lot of different groups together when it's a large scale change to see how it's affecting these different departments and understanding the gives and takes of each department. I like doing this a lot, especially with their IT departments, because sometimes people don't understand how changes affect the IT and what programs and software has to be changed and what that can mean for people at the end user side. Okay. Cross-cultural. So this can include things like transcultural sensitivity change training, transnational community building, etc. I know DEI is huge right now, so some of this is coming into play, okay, being more mindful of what that means in an organization. And then, of course, the total organization. This can be strategic planning, confrontation meetings, quality improvement. So looking at everything from the big picture, right? And saying, okay, what's going on, what's working, what's not working, okay? So everything from big picture all the way down to that micro level, okay? And of course, large scale technologies. And this comes back to appreciative inquiry, collaborative loops, dialogue and deliberation. So some of these really bigger types of skills that happen when individuals don't even see it happening, if that makes sense. So these are some of these big behind the scenes things that happen that change managers have to be aware of and are working on and looking at and examining throughout the change management process. So I'm sure all of my L&D people are like, I totally want to do all of this. Never, right? At least I'm making Kevin laugh. That makes me feel good. So becoming a champion of change. So people do respond to change in several ways, but you can be proactive and you can be a champion of change, just like I was talking about before. So some of these ways include understanding and accepting your emotions. And this one's hard. This goes back to that mental map. It's why am I reacting in this specific way to this change? What about it is triggering this negative or positive response? Work to balance your emotional response to change and maintain your perspective. This is hard for people, is to remain as objective about a change as possible. You want to try and remain neutral with what the change is really going to do to you without saying, oh, it's going to be fantastic, because if you're too optimistic, you might get really derailed when any tiny little thing happens. But if you're too pessimistic, you might not actually embrace the change completely. You want to take time to step back and analyze what the change means to you, especially if it's a large scale change. You have to step back and reflect on it. You identify the little steps that need to happen to achieve the change. I always like to say you can't climb Mount Everest in a day. You have to go bit by bit, right? You can't do it all at one shot. You really accomplish these major goals piece by piece. And the same thing happens with a big change in an organization. You have to make sure your approach to overcoming obstacles is well thought out. So some of these old coping strategies that people have to overcoming obstacles just aren't going to work. If some of it's, oh, I'm going to wait until so-and-so does it for me, like the inactive people, that's probably the most ineffective. At least the people arguing about it are acknowledging there's something happening. The people that just kind of sit back and they let everybody else do the work for them, they're going to have the hardest time overcoming obstacles, right? Change, it takes determination, perseverance, and patience, especially at the large scale, which many of you are probably already aware of. It's not something that's just going to happen overnight. So it takes a lot of time and that constant reinforcement and patience to make sure that people side of it are able to adapt well and take that change and continue with it long after. Okay. Acknowledge the small victories, just like climbing Mount Everest. You get that first peak, you celebrate that. So when people start getting it right, we celebrate that small victory. Okay. You break down the process into small components. You're probably seeing a trend here. You break it down into small chunks. And what helps is that this helps people envision that end result, right? So anytime you're doing something, you look at kind of those small pieces and say, okay, here's this component that we just finished. Great, let's go to the next step. Fantastic, let's go to the next step. And this is why big changes need to happen almost incrementally. Hi, David, how are you?
I'm good, good to see you.
Good to see
I
you.
have a question. Which
Absolutely.
Is, my question is, I mean, I completely agree that it takes time, you have to break things down and so forth. But I've known any number of senior managers who are not patient.
Many of them are not.
And when you say, look, this is going to take a lot of time, I mean, how do you keep them on board? I mean, because in reality, this is what needs to be done. But what strategies do you use to keep them on board so you can do this?
Great question. So right off the bat, usually I go in and I say, what are your expectations? And in part of that is your time expectation. And then how do you think this is going to get done? So it's almost setting those expectations early on and understanding what their expectation is. Because to your point, they're not very patient. So they're going to say, well, I want this done next month. And you're going to say, okay, so realistically, what do you think is really going to happen? And it's usually asking them of something that they've tried to implement previously. And they'll say, well, it took 2 months for this. It took 3 months for this. So I'll say, okay, do you really think that this new initiative you're trying to do will happen in a month? And often they'll say no, because that's just realistic. So it's coming back and saying, realistically, how long does this piece of this process take? So you break it down into chunks. How much do you think this would take? Oh, that could take a week. You're right, it would take a week. Now, what if a hurricane hits, right? And then you have to close for a week. Then you extend it out. Well, yeah, things happen. And you just have to build that almost this conversation of, okay, realistically, how long are these small components going to take to finish? And that's why breaking the process down into smaller components is almost essential. Because if they see how long those smaller pieces are going to take and they acknowledge they're going to take, this could take a month, this could take 3 weeks, this is going to take this amount of time, you say, okay, do you really think that this 1 month time span that you initially expected is going to be really realistic when you see all of these small pieces are going to take X amount of time and you've kind of broken it down? And they kind of have to say, well, no, I'm not being realistic. And you're always going to get that person's like, well, I think I can get it done in a month. And I say, okay, well, I think maybe I'm not going to be the right consultant for you because I want to do this the right way. And that'll usually end the relationship there. And they come back a few months later when they realize their month didn't work and we do it the right way. But oftentimes that's usually that conversation that has to happen up front to set the realistic expectation. Otherwise, you're going to lose them a month, 2 months later. If you're really extending out what their expected time frame was. Great question.
And I assume you have to reinforce that every few weeks.
Yes.
And the other thing I have, I'm not expecting an answer to this necessarily, but I've worked with some executives who actually, you know, they're in position for maybe a year, maybe 2 years, and depending on when they call you in, you've got whatever time they have left, because the next person may have a different agenda, you know.
Yes.
And you know.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that's a delicate place to be in. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I wasn't expecting you to. There is no set answer for this, but I just wanted to bring it up. You know.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. You kind of go in as gracefully as you can, and if you have to exit, you exit as gracefully as you can. That's about the best you can do in those types of situations. Because you're right, it does happen. Usually, if they're calling and it's almost too little too late at that point, which is unfortunate. Yeah. But great points. All right. So again, becoming a champion of change involves taking ownership and implementing the change. So again, and this comes down even at the individual level, is you have to take ownership of your change process, right? And then keep an open mind, remain flexible, and above all, maintain your sense of humor, okay? Things will almost always go wrong at the most inopportune time, right? You'll go into a meeting having just spilled coffee on yourself and you're like, fantastic, I look like I can't keep myself together. Or like, you never know what's going to happen, right? So you just have to try to maintain your sense of humor no matter what. I mean, obviously not no matter what. If somebody dies, please be respectful for that. But in appropriate cases, keep that sense of humor, because guess what? Life is going to happen. There's nothing we can do to control certain things. And especially an executive, kind of to David's point, being shown the door, you can't control that. So you just try to maintain your composure, maintain your sense of humor, and move on with your life, right? And that's the best you can do, okay? So how the pandemic changed change management. And I understand we're coming up on time, so I might, if I go over, is that okay? I'm getting nodded.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Thank you. If you guys need to leave, I fully understand. I know it's getting late. But so a culture of uncertainty. So in March 2020, many businesses, as we all know, were suddenly closing their doors. And the expectation was, and this is key here, the expectation was to reopen within 2 weeks. This goes back to what we were saying, the expectation, right? However, people were forced to learn to work from home, and many had school-age children suddenly schooling from home, right? I'm sure there are countless cases where we've been on meetings where someone's kid was in the background trying to figure out math or English, or in my case, my kindergarten child literally threw a tantrum because she didn't understand what she was doing in the middle of a meeting. And you just smile and you hit mute. You're like, I'm so sorry. And you mute and you're just like, I'll be right back. And you run and you try to deal with it. And you're like, please stop screaming, and you move on. But there's nothing you can do to control that. You just take grace and humility, right? Unfortunately, often leadership wasn't really sure what that next steps were, and they didn't know what they looked like. And it led to a lack of communication because they didn't know what was going on. Okay, and it actually caused increased frustration with the uncertainty, because most leaders don't like to admit they don't know. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that, but most of the time, people in leadership positions want to send the message that they have everything under control. The fact is, they just didn't, right? We were kind of at the whim of state restrictions, of governors saying this has to happen, of this like this needs to stay closed, you need to wear a mask, whatever's going on. We don't have control of any of that. So we need to really say, I don't know, right? And of course, as weeks went into months, many businesses were forced to be in the kind of this constant state of uncertainty and waiting. And you see the guy like, I don't know, that seems to be what most people kind of felt like for the last year and a half, right? I think most of us felt like that at least at some point throughout the pandemic. Okay. So really how change management professionals can really take this pandemic and the state of uncertainty and really help companies navigate this state of uncertainty as best as possible is taking some insight from project management. Okay. So a lot of these change initiatives and organizations, like I said before, are planned. They're well thought out. These are done in advance of the change being implemented. And of course, organizations and leaders became increasingly stressed and frustrated with being thrust into unknown territory for unknown periods of time. Okay, so change management consultants can learn from some common project management theories. And project management, just so you know, in case you don't, is a process of leading a team to achieve goals within given constraints. Often it's time, money, and scope, right? So the waterfall approach is a linear and sequential approach. It divides projects into distinct phases. It focuses on product delivery, and requirements are planned at the onset, and it really avoids scope changes. Many times a change initiative actually kind of follows this type of mindset. It's we're doing this and this is what it is, and we're out and we're done, right? And there's testing at the end to make sure it was successful. So you set the requirements, you set your design, you implement, and you verify, and you maintain. right? That sounds like an overly simplistic version of what change consulting just looked like, right? However, as you saw, change management processes are much more involved than just this, and project management is too, obviously. However, when we're looking at an agile method in theory, it's incremental and iterative. Okay, you complete many small projects. You focus on that customer satisfaction, or in this case, we'd want to focus on employee satisfaction. Okay, requirements can change daily as the needs change daily. And there's testing throughout to see what's working. Is this working? Is this not working? How can we fix this? Yes, Kevin.
Just in terms of agile, I've worked for a couple of different companies in order to enact the change. When I worked for Petco, they had an agile center of excellence. So
Awesome.
what they had was they not only had specific guidelines for teams using Kanban or Lean or Scrum, which is the most popular one, but they actually had coaches and trainers as part of that.
Oh,
so it's one thing just throwing agile at people and say, good luck.
Go do it. Yeah.
It's the other thing. Yeah. What we did at Petco was we took one project, made it as a pilot project, and then showed other projects and other Scrum Masters and product owners that this could really work. But without that background, that support from behind, it doesn't really become too successful. So in my experience, it's really important to have at least an agile coach and an agile trainer involved.
Absolutely. Yeah. Kevin's offering his services to anybody who wants to have agile training behind them. And of course, it enables operation without necessarily having a dedicated project manager, which can be great in this type of uncertain situation, okay? So what you do is you go in and you evaluate the current processes and structures. What's going on right now, right? And you kind of look at it and you suggest improvements. You say, hey, here's what needs to improve. Here's how we can improve it. And then do the application design. You design how to apply that improvement. The application construction, implementation. So you develop it and you implement it. I hit the wrong button. Evaluate and monitor, but it's constant. And then you go back through this cycle of you evaluate the current processes and you suggest improvements as we go. And this can be really helpful process in times of uncertainty, because as things are constantly changing, you don't want to get hung up on this is how we're doing it, but rather saying, okay, this is what's going on today. Let's keep going through this process and seeing what we need to do to keep improving, to make sure that our product is getting out, that our customers are happy, that our employees are staying engaged and we're not burning them out, right? That was probably one of the biggest things a lot of employees complained about, is burnout. As companies had to let go of a lot of staff due to reduction in customers, what happened was the people who got left behind ended up getting burned out because they had to take on more responsibility while working from home, while teaching their kids, while doing this, with a dog barking at the Amazon driver, with who knows what going on, right? People get very stressed when they have to juggle many things at once and they don't have something saying, hey, relax, you're okay. And when there's this constant, we don't know what's going on and just keep doing it, thumbs up, that doesn't actually help people, right? If you've ever gotten that kind of a pat on the back by thanks for being here, you're almost like, cool, I'm dying inside. And I think so many people over the last year have had that kind of feeling. And as trainers, as change management consultants, that's the last thing we want, is to have people overwhelmed with even more stuff tacked on. So we want to make sure that what we're doing is improving their day-to-day life, making things easier for them, right? We want to make changes that are going to be easier. If someone's working from home, we can say, hey, you're going to connect to the VPN and we're going to show you how to do it. It's really easy. And then you're going to have access to all of these shared drives and all of these things. And this is a quick and easy win for you, right? And that can improve some functionality when people are in a remote setting, right? Some things like that can be done really quickly. Some things are going to take time, but then it's a constant going back and saying, is this working? What are people saying? Are people engaged? Are they feeling better? Are we still getting through this cycle? And then as better information comes out, as people are saying, okay, we're looking at going back to the office, propose the new change. Say, this is what this might look like as we move forward, right? So as we're moving through these times and we have so many things that are uncertain or outside of our control, we don't want to have something that's strict waterfall method, because that bottom end result might not stay the same in the next 5 months. That might have to change. So we need to be open and flexible to revisiting that result almost constantly, saying, is this still working? Is it not? What are people saying? How are my employees engaging with this? Are they still happy? Have I had a lot of people resign? Like, is my company part of the Great Resignation? If I am, what am I doing wrong? So we need to look at that, because that's where this process needs to come, is this kind of constantly going back and saying, how can I improve and go through it? And it's not just throwing it at the wall and seeing what sticks, but a really thoughtful, worked out design of what are we doing. And that's where sometimes having an external consultant who's unbiased, who can see outside of the box, come in and do some of these analyses and diagnostic tests, can say, hey, this is what it's looking like. This is what some of the feedback we're hearing is. So that's really why a change management consultant can be really useful in helping an organization get through some of this uncertainty. Okay. Any questions? I know that was a lot. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Thumbs up, right? Okay. So one main thing, however, that we have to be careful when we're doing something that's almost continual changing like this, is to avoid what's called a transition trap. And this can be really difficult, okay? So you have to be able to know the difference between a tactical transition plan and a long-term transformational strategy. And you have to be able to communicate that, okay? So transitional moves are reactions to external circumstances, which is exactly what COVID has been. It's an external circumstance. So we're making transition plans, and that's what needs to be communicated. This is just a transition while we get through COVID. Okay, this is not going to be, it's not intended to be, rather, a transformational strategy. It might end up a transformational strategy, as some companies have found out, but that's not necessarily the intent. So you're wanting to say, hey, this is transitional and there's going to be constant updates. Okay. Focus on results that impact the community and the organization. So you want to direct the efforts based on tangible results that are important to the organization, to the employees, and to the customers. So you want to focus on these tangible things, right? Are they getting better work outcomes? Are people reporting that they're having an easier time getting their work done? What are things that are tangible that you can measure, that you can see, okay? And report back on that. Adjust the strategy, not the results. And this could be key here. And this goes back to kind of that method of looking at what's going wrong. If you want a certain result, when circumstances change, you don't want to change what result you're looking to get. You want to change your strategy to get to the result, right? You have to be adaptive in that regard to say, okay, this isn't working. What are we doing wrong? And then go back and find what's going wrong and try to fix that. Okay. And then reflect on short-term goals and those long-term goals. What is my short-term goal for the next 6 months? What is my longer-term goal? And reflect on them. So again, it's continuously stopping and asking, is this working? Should we keep with this strategy? Maybe the strategy we just haven't given enough time and it needs more time to work. Or have we given it enough time and we need to try something new? And again, asking, what is the purpose? Why are we doing this? Again, it comes back to that why, right? Questions, thoughts? We're good. Okay. Perfect. So the future of change management. We're all going to go skydiving. I'm kidding. I'm definitely not jumping out of a plane, by the way. That is not on my to-do list. Kevin's either. He's like, nope, that's not happening. So of course, using an agile work style can help improve the success of change initiatives, especially if we remain adaptable, right? We can use sprints, and Kevin probably knows what that is. And this is where team members are focused on prioritized work. So this goes back to knowing how to prioritize what needs to happen first, okay? So agile mindsets help prioritize people. It seeks frequent feedback. You champion that one-on-one collaboration, so working with others throughout the process. It celebrates simplicity and it welcomes change, right? So we want to make sure that when we're making these changes, we're doing something not that's overly simplistic, but that's something that's easy enough for most people to be able to take and adapt to as quickly as possible, right? We want to give people easy wins early on in the process. So when it happens to be something harder, they're more likely to say, okay, well, I did all of this and this was easy, so I can do this, even though this is a little harder, right? Just like jumping out of a plane. I'm kidding. That I don't think would ever be easy to me. But so we empower teams to determine how to complete tasks. And this, I think, is crucial. So my mentor told me a story where he was working with this company that had this major flaw in a design in their engineering, where they had these vats, and I don't remember what they were filled with, but the engineers had to go in, like the people working had to go in and try and get up to them to see what was inside just for manual inspection. But the way they built the ramp is that the ramp was too far down for them to visibly see inside of the vat. So it was an ineffective design, right? But you can't redesign a building after it's already been put together. That would be hard. And they had the team of leadership together, brainstorming, coming up with all of these ideas. And then he said, let's ask the people doing the job. And they flat out said, you could just give us some steps. And that would make it easier. Like, that was the solution. And it was literally the easiest solution that people didn't think to ask the people doing the job, right? They were trying to come up with all these different things, including camera systems and all this tech stuff. And these people are like, we just need some stairs. So that's what they did. They got somebody in there to put in some stairs and the job was done. So sometimes it comes back to asking the people who are doing the job, what do you need to do this better? And we cannot forget to ask them their input, because they are the ones actively doing the job day to day, right? And I think a lot of times we forget that. We also want to ensure that transparency is a cornerstone to change. Again, this comes back to communicating. I cannot stress this enough. You want to make sure that when a change is coming and when new things are happening, you communicate it as effectively as possible to the people who need to know it when they need to know it, right? So not a day before, weeks before, to give them that time to ask questions, to process it, to understand it, to be able to figure out how to implement the change. Okay, does someone have a question? No, okay. And again, if at first you don't succeed, try and try again. I know that's like that age-old college try, right? We all say that. However, when we're doing change management initiatives, especially going now, you want to measure, improve, and focus through collaboration, okay? So we're doing this thoughtfully. It's not just, hey, we're gonna go this way because this way didn't work, but it's, why didn't this way work? Let's look at it, let's see what happened. Was it something easy to fix that didn't work, or was it something major that is not going to work at all? Does that make sense? Okay, perfect. And foster community by working closely together, okay? Ultimately, when we're going through change, it can be uncertain. It can bring up lots of feelings that people don't necessarily like, which we talked about earlier. But if you foster a sense of community with your employees, with your colleagues, with the other people in the organization, and you work closely with them, you can actually hear some of their concerns, address them early on in the change process, and get through it easier without some of those huge derailments, okay? And that is the end. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing, and thank you. I apologize for going over on my time, but thank you everybody for staying with me. And I know it's been a very long night, but if you have any other questions, feel free to ask away.
Kind of had one. Did you want to go?
No, go ahead, Juan.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It was, what would you say, or if you ever maybe encountered someone who's a trainer but with an OD mentality, right? So you definitely you have to build these knowledge and skills and abilities, but you have such an OD mentality that it's going to take long. But as it was mentioned earlier, sometimes managers, supervisors, executives, their patience is just not really there.
So sometimes that's when you go back and you ask the purpose. You say to your manager, what is the purpose of this? What am I doing this for? What is your end goal? And some of that can be going to your immediate supervisor, your immediate managers. What is the purpose? What are we trying to get out of this? How much are we doing this? You kind of want to ask some clarifying questions about that. I had a manager once that's like, we're going to run this survey. And I was like, cool, to do it the right way, it's going to take 3 months. He's like, you don't have 3 months, you have a month. I was like, okay, so acknowledge if I have a month to do this, it's not going to be that good. And he's like, that's fine, I just need it done. Okay, cool. So we'll do it your way. And then when you don't get the right results you want because you're doing it too quick, in 4 months, don't come complain to me because it was quick and not done right. And sometimes you give them that, but you kind of voice that saying, listen, if you want it done right, it's going to take a little bit longer.
Right.
And again, it goes back to what I was mentioning to David, is you break it down and say, how long do you realistically think this is going to take? And sometimes they're going to say, I'm willing to sacrifice quality for timeliness. And you say, okay. And you go with it, but you've already voiced it. It might not be effective. Right. And then when it's not, then they have to go back and do it the right way, which is going to take them that much longer to do it the right way. But that's a different battle. That might not be your battle to have at that point. Great question. You're welcome. Anyone else?
I was just going to say, what a great presentation. Thank you so much, Kimberly.
Oh,
awesome.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you, everybody else. So
yeah, that was very good. Thanks, Kimberly.
You're welcome. Absolutely.
Much appreciated. A lot of note taking. I don't know if it's even right for me to ask, but do you ever post your slideshow, your presentation, your slide deck?
Well, this one I think has been recorded. So if you were registered, obviously you were because you're here, you'll be able to have access to that, at least the recording of the session, okay. Which obviously will have the slide deck on it, I hope.
Okay.
That was the purpose of recording it.
If
so
it was on your screen, they should be able to see it.
Awesome.
And then there'll be a lot of starting and stopping as you write notes, you know. So.
Yeah.
There will be.
What was that slide?
That's fine.
I just wanted to say to Tom and David, if you ever want someone to give a presentation on Agile, I'm your man.
Well, Kevin, you and I are supposed to
mind.
talk sometime next week.
Thanks.
Well, it's next month. I don't think it's
Really?
next year, actually, I think.
No, I know, but you and I are supposed to talk about stuff.
Oh, we are. Yes, sir. Absolutely.
So send me a Zoom link, Kevin.
I will. Absolutely. Thank you, David.
Okay.
Appreciate it. And thanks, Tom. Thanks for facilitating, hosting. Appreciate it.
Also, just thanks again for Dr. Kimberly Morse for giving her presentation. But if I could just steal a few more minutes of your time, I want to point everybody to the chat. And if you have a few minutes, you can take a few minutes and fill out the survey form for us. That feedback is very important to us because this lets us know if we're doing the right things and keeping the members engaged. So if you, before you leave, go ahead and click on that link and fill out the form and give us your feedback. And I also want to just remind everybody to continue to check out our website at tdsandiego.org/events for all our upcoming workshops. And it was great seeing everybody tonight. If anybody has any more questions for Dr. Morse, feel free to ask her. If not, then thank you for coming.
Yes, I put my LinkedIn in the chat, so you guys can anybody can feel free to connect and send me messages there. I'm happy to connect and answer anything I can.
Thanks,
Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
I know.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Welcome.
Bye, everybody.